Hello everyone, good morning. I am EMSG Ekanayaka and I'm here to present my research proposal on exploring the impact of spaced repetition technique on vocabulary retention beyond exam-centered learning, on long-term vocabulary retention in Sri Lankan tuition students aged 8 to 12. So here comes my overview of the presentation today. Firstly, I'll talk about the introduction. Then I'll move to background of the study area, problem statement, research questions, research objectives, literature review, rationale, methodology, significance of the study, expected outcomes, and finally concluding along with the references. So let's start with why this research is significant. In Sri Lanka, English proficiency is not just a subject taught in schools, and it's a critical and crucial skill for academic and professional growth. Silva 2021 emphasizes that mastering English opens doors to better educational opportunities and higher paying jobs. However, there's a pressing issue in how English is taught in Sri Lankan tuition centers. As Jay Kumar and Rajaratnam 2022 observed, these centers focus almost exclusively on preparing students for exams. While this helps students pass exams, it does little to develop their long-lasting language skills. So additionally, current methods used in tuition classes often lack sustainable memory strategies. Vijay Ratna et al. 2023 point out that techniques like rote memorization might help students recall information temporarily, but they don't support retention over time. Therefore, this research aims to fill that gap by introducing and evaluating on effectiveness of spaced repetition, a scientifically validated approach to enhance long-term retention. So this is the background of the study. Tuition classes are an integral part of Sri Lanka's educational system, and they provide additional support for students, especially in subjects like English, where there is intense competition. However, Gunasekara 2023 highlights a significant drawback that these classes rely heavily on rote memorization technique. So this method prioritizes short-term recall over meaningful understanding and long-term retention. So now let's talk about the target age group. Students aged 8 to 12 are at a critical stage of cognitive development. Brown and Singh 2021 explained that during this period, children are highly receptive to learning new concepts and developing long-term memory. So this makes them an ideal group for testing strategies like spaced repetition. So despite its proven benefits, spaced repetition is rarely used in Sri Lankan tuition classes. Anderson and Lee 2023 advocate for its use as it is specifically designed to strengthen long-term memory by spacing out learning sessions. Therefore, this research seeks to explore its potential in the Sri Lankan context. Right, so this is the study area, and the study area is set in Kurunegala, a key educational hub in Sri Lanka. So why Kurunegala? It's a region that attracts students from multiple districts, offering a rich and diverse pool of learners. So this diversity is essential for assessing how spaced repetition performs across different backgrounds. The rationale for choosing this location is that it's high demand for English tuition. And this reflects The exam-focused nature of teaching prevalent across the country, making Kurunagala an ideal case study for testing alternative methods like spaced repetition. Therefore, we plan to work with a sample of 100 students from various tuition centers. To ensure diversity, the sample will include students from both urban and rural areas. This approach will help me to explore whether factors like socioeconomic status and prior exposure to English influence the effectiveness of spaced repetition. Here comes the problem statement of my study. And the core problem, as Rahman and Fernando 22 explain, is that tuition classes in Sri Lanka are overwhelmingly exam-driven. While this approach may help students perform well in tests, it doesn't equip them with the necessary skills needed for real-world communication. Moreover, Tilakaratna and Gamage 2022 highlight a significant challenge that the teaching methods are currently used in tuition classes and they do not support deep or lasting learning. Instead, they encourage surface-level memorization. Therefore, my research focuses on finding a solution to this issue. Specifically, I'll explore with the spaced repetition technique. A technique designed to reinforce learning over time can address these limitations and enhance long-term vocabulary retention. Right. Now let's dive into the research questions which form the core of my investigation. Right. The first question explores how exam-centered learning in Sri Lankan tuition classes influences long-term retention in students aged 8 to 12. So as mentioned earlier, this age group is crucial for language acquisition. So it's important to examine how current teaching methods are impacting their vocabulary retention. The second question examines how introducing a spaced repetition technique and evidence-based technique for enhancing long-term memory can improve retention rates compared to traditional exam-based methods. And this will help us understand if the shift from short-term memorization to a more structured learning approach yields better results. And the third question looks at the real-world application of vocabulary retention. So how well can students retain and use the vocabulary they learn in actual scenarios such as conversation or writing tasks? This helps assess the practical value of spaced repetition beyond exams. The fourth question evaluates the perception of both teachers and students on effectiveness of spaced repetition. So by gathering feedback from those directly involved in the learning process, we can assess how well this method resonates with the students and whether teachers find it feasible in a tuition setting. Finally, the fifth question addresses the challenges and benefits of implementing spaced repetition in tuition classes. And it's crucial to understand the barriers adopting this technique as well as its potential advantages to ensure its practical application in Sri Lankan tuition systems. All right, the research objectives. The research objectives are closely aligned with the questions I've just outlined, and these objectives will guide my study and shape the methodology. The first objective is to understand the impact of exam-centered learning on long-term vocabulary retention. And this will help us determine the limitations of the current system. The second objective assesses how incorporating spaced repetition into teaching process affects vocabulary retention over time. And I aim to determine whether this technique offers a more sustainable approach compared to traditional methods. So the third objective focuses on real-world applicability, whether the vocabulary learned via spaced repetition is actually retained and used in practical situations. The fourth objective is to get the qualitative feedback from both students and teachers, allowing us to evaluate the perceived effectiveness of spaced repetition in the classroom. And finally, the fifth objective looks at the practical side of implementing spaced repetition, understanding the challenges that might arise, as well as the benefits this approach could bring to tuition classes. Right, now let's review the literature that underpins this research. So research by Brown and Singh 2021 reinforces the importance of effective vocabulary acquisition in language proficiency. Vocabulary development is directly linked to cognitive development and overall academic success. It's essential not just for passing exams, but for mastering the language in practical, real-world scenarios. One strategy that has proven effective in promoting long-term memory retention is spaced repetition. Anderson and Lee 2023 highlight its role in improving retention in language learning by systematically revisiting material at increasing intervals. So this technique has shown remarkable results, especially in contexts where the goal is durable and long-term memory. However, Wijeratne et al. 2023 point out Sri Lankan tuition centers predominantly rely on rote memorization, which is more focused on short-term exam preparation rather than fostering lasting language skills. And despite the advantages of spaced repetition, it remains largely underutilized in Sri Lankan tuition centers, especially with young learners. So this is a gap I aim to address with my research. Right, the rationale behind this study is straightforward, that current educational practices in Sri Lanka, especially in tuition centers, focuses on exam and short-term memorization. As Gunasekara 2023 notes, this model limits students' ability to retain knowledge in the long term, and students might perform well on tests but fail to retain vocabulary outside the exam context. An alternative to this approach is spaced repetition. So Tilakaratne and Gamage 2022 suggests that spaced repetition, which involves reviewing material at spaced intervals, helps improve long-term vocabulary recall. And this structured approach is grounded in cognitive psychology and memory retention principles. So the impact of my research will be twofold. First, it will provide an evidence of the effectiveness of spaced repetition in improving long-term retention in Sri Lankan tuition classes. And second, it will introduce a more sustainable and effective learning method that could be integrated into the broader educational framework in Sri Lanka. To collect data for my study, I will undergo with this methodology, and I will use a combination of pre-test, post-test, surveys, interviews, and teacher feedback. So as the pre-test and post-test, The pretest will assess the student's baseline vocabulary knowledge before the intervention, and after 6 weeks of implementing the spaced repetition, a post-test will measure the student's vocabulary retention to determine the impact of this method. And in addition to the tests, I will distribute a survey to the students asking them about their perceptions of spaced repetition compared to a traditional exam-centered approach. And to get more detailed insights, I will also conduct interviews with 20 randomly selected students, providing a deep understanding of how they experienced this method in real life scenarios. Teachers will also play a critical role, and during the intervention, they will observe the students and provide feedback on the practicality and effectiveness of spaced repetition in the classroom. And this feedback will be critical in evaluating whether this method is suitable for wider implication. Right. As the data analysis, I will use a combination of qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method approaches. As qualitative analysis will involve comparing the results of the pre-test and post-test. This will allow us to evaluate the extent to which spaced repetition has impacted the students' vocabulary retention over time. In addition, I will compare the results from urban and rural tuition centers to identify any regional differences in learning outcomes. The quantitative analysis will be based on the feedback collected through student surveys, teacher feedback, and interviews. This will help qualify how students and teachers perceive the effectiveness of spaced repetition and identify any challenges faced during its implementation. And by using a mixed approach, I will combine both qualitative and quantitative data to get a holistic view of the impact of spaced repetition. And this will allow me to draw conclusions not only based on test scores, but also the lived experiences and perception of students and teachers. This study holds a significant potential for both educational theory and practice. So, educational impact is that the findings will contribute to a deep understanding of memory techniques, particularly spaced repetition in the context of Sri Lankan tuition classes. It will also help educators realize that there are alternative evidence-based strategies for improving long-term language acquisition. Silva 2021 highlights the importance of moving beyond rote memorization to incorporate memory techniques that support lasting learning. The broader benefits by adopting spaced repetition, tuition centers can offer more sustainable vocabulary learning strategies. And this approach can help students retain vocabulary not just for exams, but for real-life usage, improving their overall language proficiency in the long term, as stated by Brown and Singh 2021. So, policy and practice. From a policy perspective, the findings from this study could inform curriculum improvements in English language education, and it could encourage a shift towards incorporating memory-enhancing strategies like spaced repetition into curriculum, benefiting students across the country. Now, let's consider the expected outcomes of these studies. So as findings, while the results are based on the pre-test and post-test, and feedback, I expect to find that spaced repetition is more effective than traditional rote learning methods in terms of long-term vocabulary retention. And Anderson and Lee 2023 have shown that spaced repetition significantly enhances memory retention compared to other methods. And the recommendations. This study will provide practical recommendations for tuition centers on how to incorporate spaced repetition into their teaching methods. And this could include strategies for designing lesson plans, using digital tools for spaced repetition, and structuring preview sessions. The wider implications. The results of this study could also form the basis for a framework to apply spaced repetition in other educational contexts such as schools, colleges, or language learning centers. So this would broaden the impact of the research beyond just tuition classes, helping to improve repetition, vocabulary retention, and language learning outcomes more broadly. Right. To conclude, this research has the potential to make a significant contribution to improving language learning in Sri Lanka. As the summary, the study will demonstrate that spaced repetition is a viable solution to address the gap in current tuition methods, which rely heavily on short-term memorization for exams. The ultimate goal of this research is to achieve effective and long-lasting vocabulary acquisition for Sri Lankan students. And by incorporating spaced repetition, students can better retain vocabulary over the long term, which will support their overall language development. And as the future direction, this study will lay out the groundwork for future educational reforms in Sri Lanka. So if this study proves successful, it could influence changes in teaching strategies across the country and provide a foundation for integrating memory-enhancing techniques into other educational contexts. So these are the references that I acknowledged for my study. And thank you for your attention.